A man who cannot claim his own revolt is not ready for freedom. That single truth became the starting point for a new kind of revolution. One not built on diplomacy or dependence, but on the unshakable belief that freedom must be earned, not inherited. It must be constructed, one brick, one shovel, one crop at a time. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, has never been a stranger to struggle. Colonized, exploited, and left with a fragile economy, its people have long battled the scars of outside control. But in recent years, the battle shifted. The enemy wore no uniform. It carried no flag. It crept silently through dry fields and empty granaries that it was hunger. This was not a war of bullets. It was a war of scarcity, a war where dependency replaced dignity. And in this quiet war, Captain Ibrahim Traore emerged not as a warlord, but as a cultivator of rebellion. To the rest of the world, Burkina Faso appeared weak. But Traore understood the truth. The greatest threat wasn't a lack of arms. It was a lack of autonomy. You cannot defend a nation that cannot feed itself. The soil was rich, but rainfall was unpredictable. Droughts stretched across seasons, turning fertile promise into dust. Without water, there is no food. Without food, there is no sovereignty. Every empty plate was a quiet surrender. Every imported grain a reminder that power rested elsewhere. That is why hunger, to Traore, was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was an act of submission. And submission, for him, was a form of modern colonization. He would not fight it with guns, he would fight it with water. Master the water, you master the land. Master the land, and your people no longer kneel. They stand. So began a new kind of insurgency, not waged in the streets, but in the soil. For decades, Burkina Faso had looked outward. Government contracts flowed westward. Roads, dams, even food supply chains were managed by foreign hands. Every development project was a loan, every solution an import. But Traore saw through the illusion. The shiny buildings, the endless talks, the promises of aid that only deepened dependency. It wasn't development. It was debt. So he turned inward, not to isolationism, but to self-determination. That he looked to the land, not as a commodity, but as a lifeline. He looked to the people, not as a burden, but as the solution. And he looked to water, not as a crisis, but as the battlefield. His answer was bold, deceptively simple, and radical in its symbolism. Irrigation, not policy, not politics, but trenches, canals, reservoirs. That a nation would rise not by treaties, but by tapping into its own earth. The urgency was real. The Sahel was drying faster than forecasts predicted. Once predictable weather cycles had turned erratic. Crops failed, communities fractured, aid agencies flooded in. But so did conditions, contracts, compromises. Traore refused to wait. He rejected the worn-out playbook of dependency. He understood that every day without action tightened the chains. Every drought without response was another inch of colonization. So he launched the first offensive in this quiet war. Water, redirected and reimagined. This was the seed of resistance. And it was just beginning to grow. The vision had a name. And soon, it had a form. The Bama Canal, not a metaphor, not a political slogan, but a physical channel dug into the body of the land with discipline and resolve. Planned to become the longest irrigation canal in Africa, the Bama Canal was not just about hydrology. It was about healing a nation from decades of dependence, and healing a people from the belief that they were too small to build anything big. The canal was designed to bring water to thousands of hectares. In its first phase alone, it would irrigate 1,260 hectares of rice and 70 hectares of vegetables. But those numbers, as impressive as they were only part of the story. The true revolution was in the ownership. For generations, massive infrastructure in Africa came with a catch. Foreign engineers, foreign firms, foreign rules. Projects began with handshakes in hotel lobbies and ended with profit margins outside the continent. But not this time. Traore broke the cycle. He declared that the canal would be built by Burkinabe hands, local engineers, local welders, local laborers, local vision. Not only did this move inspire national pride, it disrupted an entire system of outsourced dependency. And he didn't just hand over the project to local crews. He lit a fire under an 8-month deadline. No extensions, no excuses. A timeline that defied the sluggish pace of bureaucracy. This wasn't just infrastructure. It was a mobilization. Construction didn't stop when the sun set. Floodlights illuminated the earthworks through the night. Machines hummed under the stars. Shovels moved in sync like the strokes of a drumline. Every trench was a declaration. We can build this. We will build this. To miss a day was to fail the nation. To fall behind schedule was to dishonor the movement. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. From the foreman marking out measurements to the teenage volunteer carrying supplies, the sense of urgency was electric. This canal was no longer a government project. It had become a people's project. A generation that had only ever been told what it could not do was now shaping rivers with its bare hands. And in doing so, reshaping the country. This was never just about agriculture. It was about liberation. As the canal carved its way through the dry belly of the Bama Plains, something else began to flow alongside the water. Belief. Farmers who had long abandoned their land returned with calloused hands and cautious hope. Men and women who had once stood in ration lines now stood in their fields, measuring irrigation flows and planting seeds with pride. The land was healing, and with it, the spirit of a people. And it wasn't only about what they grew. It was about what they stopped needing. For years, Burkina Faso imported massive quantities of food. From rice to onions, staples that once grew in abundance were now trucked in from foreign ports. That dependency cost the nation not just money, but leverage. Because when you rely on someone else to feed your children, you also hand them the power to starve you. Captain Traore understood this. He said it plainly. If we grow our own food, no one can use hunger as a weapon against us. Food was no longer just sustenance. It was strategy, and with the canal came surplus. With surplus came trade, and with trade came the quiet emergence of influence. Burkina Faso was no longer simply surviving. It was beginning to shape its own economy on its own terms. Markets that once sold imported goods now brimmed with local produce. Regional partners began to take notice. What was once a small, drought-stricken country was now exporting to neighbors, not in massive volumes yet, but enough to signal something greater, that Burkina Faso could feed others, and in doing so, it could speak with a louder voice at the table. This was soft power forged in the furnace of the Sahel, not through force, but through food, not through domination, but through independence. But perhaps the most remarkable shift wasn't on the map. It was in the minds of the people. Young Burkinabe, many of whom once dreamt only of escaping to Europe or the cities, were beginning to return. The canal had done what slogans and speeches never could. It made rural life viable again. Training centers were built near the project site, not just for farming, but for irrigation technology, solar energy, logistics, and agribusiness. Education was no longer a pathway out of the village. It was a tool to transform it. Parents who once saved every coin to send their children away now watched them stay, build, and thrived in the villages along the canal. Children drank from clean water systems installed by local crews. Clinics reopened. Roads were paved. Markets bustled. These weren't foreign interventions. These were domestic achievements, and each one chipped away at a lie that had taken root over generations. That Africans must always be helped. That Africans cannot build. That Africans must follow. The people of Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Traore, were writing a different story, a story of resistance through self-reliance, of transformation through labor, of dignity reclaimed through every harvested grain. And as the harvest grew, so did something less visible, but even more important: trust. Trust between neighbors who now pooled tools instead of waiting on handouts. Trust in village councils that organized rotating work teams to keep fields watered, roads maintained, and tools repaired. Trust in local institutions that had once been hollow offices with dusty desks, but were now alive with plans and people. There were new customs too. Farmers began sharing surplus seeds with neighboring communities. Instead of selling them for short-term profit, they invested in solidarity. One village's water tower was funded by 5 others pooling funds, not under direction, but out of will. Even weddings and festivals changed. Where once foreign goods and flashy imports were seen as symbols of success, now it was proudly grown millet, home-brewed drinks, and hand-woven fabrics that marked the occasion. Identity had shifted. Pride had shifted. The definition of wealth had changed, and with that change came protection. Because people who believe in what they have built are far harder to break. What Burkina Faso was building wasn't just infrastructure. It was insulation. Insulation from dependency, from manipulation, from the kind of economic fragility that had long haunted post-colonial Africa. As the first harvests rolled in, something remarkable followed. Stability. Inflation slowed. Local currencies held firmer. Families who once struggled to afford imported rice could now purchase it locally at half the cost. Markets that were once disjointed and unpredictable found rhythm and consistency. The canal hadn't just moved water, it had moved the economy. Women, who often bore the brunt of food insecurity, became central to this new ecosystem. With steady access to water and tools, they started cooperatives, revived old seed-saving practices, and built farm-to-market networks in their communities. Their earnings began to fund home repairs, school supplies, and, in many cases, new businesses. The ripple effect was unmistakable. The Bama Canal wasn't just nourishing fields. It was nourishing futures, and for the first time in decades, those futures weren't defined by exit routes. The canal became a corridor of possibility. Along its banks, brick kilns fired up as new housing developments emerged. Small shops opened to serve the growing workforce. Micro-lending groups sprang into action, offering capital to young entrepreneurs eager to launch food processing, textiles, and solar pump services. Burkina Faso wasn't just growing crops. It was growing capacity, but the transformation didn't stop at the village level. Traore's administration saw in the canal a model, a repeatable, scalable blueprint for development without strings attached. What had begun as a single trench in a forgotten plain was now being studied by regional planners, agricultural engineers, and policy think tanks across West Africa. In international conferences, Burkina Faso's representatives no longer came to request aid. They came to share a roadmap, one rooted not in theory, but in trenches and calluses and harvested grain. And the symbolism was not lost on the people. Across the country, murals appeared on concrete walls. Children watering crops, women carrying bundles, solar pumps framed against the rising sun. The art was homemade, just like the movement. Even the schools began to shift. Curricula were updated to include practical training in food systems, permaculture, climate adaptation, and cooperative governance. Youth no longer learned just about colonization. They studied how to end its lingering effects. The very definition of development had changed. IT wasn't about dependence on outside innovation. It was about unleashing what was already there, beneath the soil, inside the people, and the world began to notice. Journalists flew in from Europe and America, expecting to cover a curious irrigation project. What they found was a civilizational pivot, a country rewriting its destiny in ditches and seeds. Some left inspired, others left unsettled. Because if Burkina Faso could do this, what excuse did the rest of the world have for its own inertia? Captain Traore, when asked about international attention, gave a simple reply: "We are not trying to impress. We are trying to survive with honor." But for many watching, survival had turned into something else: sovereignty. And that sovereignty, once planted, was spreading like roots across the continent. Burkina Faso's transformation wasn't just visible from satellites. It was felt in kitchens, heard in classrooms, and seen in the confident eyes of young children who had never known the ache of hunger. Where famine once loomed like a shadow, meals were now planned around homegrown harvests. Where elders once feared for the next season, they now taught the next generation how to read the land, save seed, and speak proudly of their labor. This wasn't charity. It was chemistry, a chemical reaction between land and belief, pressure and resolve. And the result was something deeper than any project. It was cultural re-engineering. Across Burkina Faso, families began returning to ancestral lands. Abandoned villages found new life as people rebuilt old homes, repaired mosques, and revived traditional festivals rooted in the cycles of rain and harvest. This was not regression. It was reclamation. In cities, too, the ripple was undeniable. Food prices dropped. Urban farms took root in schools, on rooftops, in alleyways. Citizens once disconnected from the rhythms of agriculture began asking questions. Where does my food come from? Who grew it? How can I help? The answer, more often than not, pointed back to one place: the canal. Not just a trench, but a turning point. The moment when Burkina Faso chose its own reflection over the image projected onto it by foreign interests. But perhaps most importantly, the Bama Canal sparked a spiritual shift. For decades, colonization was not just physical, it was psychological. It taught people to look outward for guidance, to distrust their own innovations, to wait for saviors that never came. The canal broke that cycle. It reminded a nation of its own competence, and with that reminder came confidence. Not arrogance, not nationalism, but a quiet, rooted confidence that whispered, "We can do this. We are enough." Children began writing poems about rain. Artists painted murals of farmers as heroes. Musicians sang of water as freedom. In mosques and churches, sermons began to reference the miracle not as distant scripture, but as something local, tangible, and living. It became common to hear villagers say, "Water runs through the canal, but belief runs through us." And it did. This belief rippled beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Delegations arrived from Mali, Niger, Togo, and Ghana. They didn't come as donors. They came as learners. What they found wasn't perfection. It wasn't utopia. It was something more useful. Proof. Proof that an African nation could chart its own path. Proof that agriculture could be modern without being extractive. Proof that dignity, once lost, could be restored through labor. By year's end, 3 more irrigation projects had been greenlit using the Bama model. One funded with public taxes, another crowd-funded by the diaspora, a third initiated by farmers themselves. What started as a trench in a forgotten field had become a blueprint, and that blueprint was now being copied. In mud, in sweat, and in spirit, Traore, in one of his last public addresses of the year, stood before a crowd not as a ruler, but as a witness. His voice steady, his message simple. The water we fight for is not just for crops. It is for memory, for possibility, for all those who came before us, and those who must eat after us. With that, the speech ended. But the movement did not, because something deeper had taken root beneath the canal, not just infrastructure, not just policy. A river, invisible but undeniable, flowing not through channels of concrete, but through people. A river of courage, of clarity, of homecoming. And that river now flows through the heart of Burkina Faso, strong, relentless, and free.